Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with a new video. This is going to be the Game Week 2 cheat sheet. If you guys are new to the channel, the cheat sheet is a video series that covers all the positions in FPL, the defenders, the forwards, the midfielders, and the goalkeepers, and kind of ranking players within their price brackets to see if you have any kind of gaps to fill in your squad or if there's anyone who's on your radar, for example, for an impending wildcard or something like that. If we start with the midfielders today with Andreas Pereira at 4.5, he clearly is still the best standout player. I mean, after coming through an extremely tough Liverpool game with the Harry Wilson injury as well, he exhibited just basically everything you'd like to see in a 4.5 midfielder and beyond. He plays in very offensive positions. Mitrovic clearly is the standout player within the Fulham team, but getting someone like Andreas Pereira at 4.5, hopefully playing for some weaker teams compared to Liverpool, despite Liverpool, I guess, arguably having an off day, Andreas Pereira is definitely the best value. We did see De Silva score off the bench for Brentford as well in a 30-minute outing. This is a little bit of a wait and see for me. He's more of a wild card pick where you think in the future, if he manages to find a starting spot within the Brentford team, maybe someone to look at as well. But for now, definitely Andreas Pereira is the better option. Callback as well. He could see his minutes drop off when some players who are injured return back into the Nottingham Forest team. If we move into the 5.0 to 5.5 price brackets, I feel like our initial estimation of players were not necessarily incorrect. You know, players like Bailey and Neto for me are still the best options in the game. But I think the Leeds players that I was mentioning within the Hidden Gems video that I recorded before the season started are actually definitely surging up in the rankings. And we also have some outside shouts as well. So we just go through Bailey and Neto. I really like the fact that both of them got very, very consistent minutes. And it was a huge positive sign to see that Bailey actually has the trust and the faith of the manager, compared to someone like a Watkins or even an Ings, where you can clearly see that rotation is still being done by Gerrard because he clearly doesn't have confidence in any of the independent strikers. And that gives us a bit more comfort that Bailey can stay within our teams at least for the next few weeks before we have to even consider moving away from him. What I do like about Bailey too is potentially if we are considering to move into midfielders in the future, or forwards, then an option like the Bailey spot in our team can easily be moved into someone like Mitrovic if we manage to find someone to give us a little bit more of money back within the midfield. And that's kind of how I feel like the FPL structure and template will change. It seems like the defenders are still providing incredibly good value, but a lot of us will be wanting to move into players like Mitrovic, Darwin, and potentially even players like Solanke, because Bournemouth seem to be quite competent on their first outing. As far as other players within these brackets, I've moved Dewsbury Hall as a new player here. He did have a really good preseason, but I still think he gets involved more as a centre midfield. He does have a little bit of a knack for this kind of goal scoring touch. You can see that with his really great long range goal. There are times where he bombs forward and makes these really good runs into the box and actually finds himself within a scoring opportunity. So this is something obviously that he creates himself. I would say definitely Dewsbury Hall is an option to think about. If you wanted just a simple transition away from Bailey when Leicester's run of form is actually, or run of fixtures rather, is a lot better, then Dewsbury Hall is clearly a 5.0 option we can think about. At this point in time though, I think just because Pereira is so interesting, you could really just live with someone like Pereira in your team and arguably play or put the funds into another position if you don't really prefer some of these options at 5.0, 5.5, or even 4.5. Podence is another player that has actually risen in the cheat sheet as well to kind of meet the same tier as Dewsbury Hall and Aronson. And what I like about Podence is he's had equally as good a preseason as Neto, but we have always said that Podence is a player who isn't necessarily super clinical. I mean, I still think the actual finish in the Leeds game was a little bit janky, but ultimately he is getting consistently into these positions, and this Wolves team are definitely trying to attack a lot more than they were in the previous year. So that already gives me a little bit of comfort over how many chances Podence is going to get, even if he might fluff up some of them. Goncalo Guedes as well is coming from Valencia, and that might change things, but I imagine that Podence for now is still going to be a top option. Definitely not someone I'd like to move into at this point in time. I'd like to see actually Wolves play a few more games, see how Guedes actually adapts into the team. So it's more of a wait and see for me. I just feel like our transfers should be placed around some of the more expensive players who we would expect to be getting us more consistent points if we feel like we've gotten some of those options wrong, as opposed to spending our transfers on the budget players, because that is probably going to be less value when we kind of think about how our price bias works in FPL. As far as someone like Aronson, I still feel like he played very, very well in the Leeds game. Could have arguably gotten one of the assists for the own goals, or rather a goal if it wasn't an own goal. As far as Pascal Gross, I mean, I just think, or Gross, sorry, he just seemed to be a player who was actually in the right positions. I think this Brighton team is interesting in that players like Welbeck are exhibiting really good performances, but not necessarily getting themselves onto the score sheet super often. whereas you'll see players like McAllister, Gross be involved. I think Trossard and Welbeck are still the key players within this Brighton team for now, at least in terms of how the attack functions, and that might change in due course. But I feel like the issue with Brighton is when you go into these players and you don't go into an option like Trossard, ultimately a lot of these players will have independently good weeks, but I don't think they'll be super consistent. I'm just not seeing anything tactically where Grobe, for example, is a player that you're consistently seeing or will be seeing scoring. So that's kind of the issue. I feel like it's definitely a wait and see with Brighton unless he continues to duplicate this kind of form that he exhibited in the United game. For now, probably just a wait and see. As far as the 6.0 price point and beyond, I've still kept it relatively simple. Martinelli and Trossard still the best options for me. Rodrigo has surged up as a player himself. Rodrigo was someone who was also on my Hidden Gems video and someone that I did see at times play within that right wing position. That's exactly kind of where he scored the goal. He kind of plays right inside forward almost positionally. And the thing is too, I do think it was a little bit of bad goalkeeping from Jose Sa. Also pretty poor defense from someone like Ait Nouri, who for some reason decided not to kind of take the ball outside of the box, but rather decided to dribble inside into the opponent's kind of feet. Not really sure what that was about, but there will be chances for Rodrigo to actually find himself scoring. I've also seen him score in very, very tight pockets within the preseason itself, and it was good to see that he was able to duplicate that within the Leeds game and versus Wolves. So I do think Rodrigo can be a good option in the future. He does play in the positions that you'd like, but there is going to be a comparison with other players as well. So Harrison is there, Bamford is there. I'm just not seeing anything right now to kind of suggest that Rodrigo is going to be that prime option. I still think Bamford potentially over the course of the season might be the best option coming from Leeds, but Rodrigo does fill an interesting price point and a need potentially if we are, let's say, to pivot away from Martinelli for whatever reason, or if, let's say, we are tired of the 8.0 midfielders and we want to move into a 4-3-3 structure, you could arguably go into having Rodrigo into your team and then inserting Mitrovic within the team as well, within the forward position, and then allowing you to flexibly play 4-3-3. As an example. So those kind of things to think about, and that's why I think Rodrigo holds such an interesting position in FPL at this point in time. Rashford and Odegaard, these were both players for me who within their respective games had great opportunities to score. Odegaard, we know, is not exactly the most clinical finisher. He's not very double-footed as a player. He's in fact very one-footed and prefers to shoot with his left. So if you compare, let's say, the preseason Chelsea game where he was able to score off a Martinelli pass when he was in the kind of left side of the box and ready to kind of cut it towards the wide area of the goal, versus when Jesus cut it back to him in the Crystal Palace game and he kind of had to stumble over his right foot and then move it towards his left before he could find a goal scoring position. That's kind of the issues you're dealing with Odegaard as a scoring option. He is a very creative piece. He is clearly making those runs forward. But how clinical is he? Is he worth more value than Martinelli? Absolutely not. Compared to someone like Saka, who consistently finds himself in goal-scoring positions, I really don't think there's a comparison there either. And that's what I think makes Odegaard the odd one out, because the Arsenal defensive options are also at such great prices. He just seems like one to miss. Ultimately, if you feel like you'd like to go Odegaard for whatever reason, let's say if you already have Martinelli, you don't want to push the funds towards getting Saka, I can kind of understand doing that. But that's kind of why I feel like Odegaard is the odd duckling in a sense within this Arsenal team when we're talking about FPL prices. Rashford, on the other hand, did exhibit a decent performance, I would say, in terms of positionally what kind of spots he was taking and how involved we'd like to see an FPL asset. Ultimately, Brighton is what we consider to be a top team in FPL and also in the Premier League. They do frequently boss some of the top sides in the league. I wouldn't necessarily Man United is the top side now, but we've seen very comfortable performances where Brighton have swept aside some very, very solid teams, and that was one of those occasions. In my opinion, Rashford was still within a very, very good goal-scoring position. If he is playing centre forward, if Martial is still injured, if Ronaldo still has a kind of weird situation with United, definitely still an option to think about at 6.5. And arguably better than Sancho for now, because I just wouldn't really want to be investing 7.5 million of my funds into a United player in this kind of FPL template for now. So Rashford for me still remains as a good option. Potentially if we see continually bad Man United performances and they don't get any better in Ten Hag, he could continue to skid down the rankings. But I still think Rashford is still well priced at this point in time. As far as all the other players within the bracket below, Bruno Guimaraes, Lingard, Saint-Maximin, these are players that I would still avoid for now. I think I would even preemptively drop them to an avoid just because they don't really seem like interesting options. You're going to have better pieces elsewhere. The one issue I mentioned with Newcastle is that the goals can come from so many different places, and Wilson is still the talisman of this team. Joe Linton is also an incredibly interesting option to think about. And I just don't want to kind of pick different midfielders between Newcastle, because unlike Arsenal, I don't have the same confidence that they'll all be involved within play. In the Arsenal team, you kind of have three forwards, and then Odegaard at times supplementing things with also the fullbacks being slightly involved, but not that attacking. Whereas with this Newcastle team, you have a strong mix and squad of attacking players that I don't think I can confidently say will continually get chances as opposed to, or outside of, let's say, Callum Wilson as an example. If we move into the 7.0 and 7.5 price bracket, this is a really tricky area in FPL for now. I think it's actually a complete avoid within the midfielder position. As you can see, I've moved a lot of these players into avoid, with Barnes having an injury, Grealish just not being interesting, and then Coutinho also just for me being way too overpriced for an Aston Villa team that we haven't seen play considerably well at this point in time, even though they arguably upgraded in some positions this season in the summer. So that's kind of the worry for me with players like that. As far as Sancho and Zaha, I have downgraded Sancho preemptively into kind of an intermediate option. I don't think this United team are good enough, and I don't think Sancho's independently good enough as well to warrant the kind of value at 7.5 when you have other teams gelling and doing extremely well, such as the Arsenal team, where you have someone like Saka, which I would definitely argue the 0.5 million is worth to push into that kind of price bracket. As far as Zaha, he has incredibly tough games, as you can see with the fixture difficulty. He's got Liverpool and he's got City, and that really complicates things. But otherwise, when just watching the Arsenal and Crystal Palace game, I thought Zaha looked immense. Gave Ben White an incredibly tough time and probably could have drawn a penalty on another day. The Crystal Palace team look really, really cohesive as well. I really like really happy that he's come back from injury and he looks just as good as he did 2 years ago when he kind of established himself in Roy Hodgson's last kind of side for Crystal Palace. As far as the rest of the team as well, really good centre-back partnerships. I think the fullbacks play a very consistent kind of defensive role too. I just think Zaha is going to be an immense piece probably after game week 4. After we probably see that City game come to an end, that bad run of fixtures for Crystal Palace hopefully smoothing up a little bit, and that's when we think about Zaha as a prime option in FPL in my opinion. But for now, he's going to just stay as a light green option, or rather yellow option. I just don't see how you can pick Zaha amidst this kind of toughness of fixtures. Moving on to the 8.0 to 8.5 players, I really think Saka and Diaz are still the best options in the game, although I would already preemptively say that Saka seems like the best option by far, even though he only got an assist compared to someone like Kulusevski, who got 1 goal, 1 assist, and some of the other players who were also involved in their outings. I think Diaz for now is interesting just because Liverpool have such good games on the cards, and we still expect them to be a top kind of offensive team. But Diaz for me is someone who, as I mentioned, just watching from the Community Shield match, he does seem to get affected when Darwin comes into the field. Darwin occupies the central space so well, and I do think that kind of diminishes Luis Diaz's chances on goal, and even from a creative point of view, because I don't think he's as established a creative player like even Salah, who has a really great cross, even though we expect him to be that sort of goal-scoring lethal asset. As far as Luis Diaz, though, as I said, the fixtures are still really good. I still imagine this Liverpool team will kind of kick on from the Fulham game and play better performances, and he's still probably a top option when we compare to the other 8.0 mids, just because the fixtures are much better. So for now, I would preemptively say he's still at that sort of top ranking. I'm kind of hesitant to move him down to the same level as the players in the tier below, but I do think Saka is just a little bit better as an option for now. And that's because we know Saka is going to have the expected minutes. He doesn't have to deal with the threat of Jota coming back into the team. We already saw, for example, someone like Fabio Carvalho take some minutes away from Luis Diaz, so that wasn't an entirely positive sign. And those are the kind of things we have to think about. But when we just remember Luis Diaz's performance versus Fulham, he still ultimately did hit the post, so he was still involved in good chances. And I think that there's no need to kind of completely write him off as an asset immediately. I think there's more pressing transfers for, let's say, if people wanted to go from Kane to Haaland as an example. And also just this period being one of the more patient periods in FPL where we should be analyzing data, should be analyzing teams and their tactics and trying to understand a little bit more. I wouldn't preemptively move off of Luis Diaz for now unless you were wholly confident in, let's say, someone like Saka or even Foden, with their chances of getting really good minutes and also playing for, once again, another very, very good team on the same level in terms of being able to create consistent attacking chances. So Saka and Diaz still the best for me. Mount is an interesting option. I have to say that Mount didn't get the minutes that I expected that he would in an Everton game. He also looked quite poor, understandably, and those are one of those days where Tuchel is so ruthless as manager that he will sub off someone who he trusts. I think Mount ultimately last season was one of Chelsea's key attackers, probably their key attacker if we're being honest, and he still has the chance to get rotated and subbed off under Tuchel's management, which is something that you don't really see. Let's say Saka is having a bad day for Arsenal under Arteta. And that's kind of the risk with Mount and why I've preemptively moved him down in what should have been an easy matchup versus Everton, because simply this Everton team is a very weak team. Mount didn't have the best of performances and he was subbed off early. So I feel like this is a key opportunity to drop Mount and just say that he's probably on the tier below options like Saka and Diaz. And another thing too with Chelsea is just, I did mention over the last few years, we haven't really seen them consistently build enough attacking chances. And I don't think the Sterling transfer is enough to make us say, they're going to absolutely crush some teams from an offensive point of view. Very often what we've seen is a lot of chance building, but not too many kind of key chance involvements from the strikers and the attackers. In fact, it was once again another outing where the fullbacks were the focal point from an FPL asset point of view. Reece James bombing this Everton team with plenty of crosses, and then also Chilwell drawing an assist for himself before getting subbed off quite early. So these are the kind of things we want to think about when we're talking about FPL. I really think Reece James and Chilwell remain the best Chelsea options to go for, and Sterling and Mount are arguably a little bit too overpriced, considering how many goal involvements this Chelsea attack is really subject to. As far as Maddison, another very, very good performance versus Brentford, got an assist, and has continued with his preseason and kind of prior year form. I just think Maddison is one of the better options in the game when the fixtures are better, and the fixtures are quite tough. Arsenal away from home, Chelsea away from home, those are tough games. Even Man United, let's say playing at home, could arguably a tough match for Leicester as well, because we know that they're quite a weak team from a defensive point of view and their ability to kind of retain the ball as a side. And that's kind of what I don't like. Obviously, you have some unique fixtures there, like Southampton at home, but when you compare it to options like Saka, Diaz, or even Mount, for example, even if he has diminished minutes, I just feel like you have to kind of keep them on the level in between options like Mount and Maddison. As far as Bowen and Kulusevski, Bowen is actually going to head towards a really, really good run now. And the one thing I would say is West Ham haven't really exhibited the best kind of goal-scoring form, creative form as well. I don't think Bowen has kind of gotten any worse as an asset or as a player. Ultimately just been a 2 or 3 month break, and I think this West Ham team have actually retained most of their key players, potentially upgrading in some places as well, like getting Cornet into the side. So these are the kind of things that I'm thinking about with West Ham, where ultimately I would like to see a little bit more involvement within the team of other players alongside Bowen to make me value Bowen as a better asset. But at 8.5, I think he just holds a really weird price point. There's not going to be a lot of managers who actually have that 0.5 million to spare for someone like Bowen. Just like, for example, a lot of people are finding immense difficulty in incorporating someone like Darwin Nunez in their team, who's 1.0 more than Jesus. These are the kind of things we have to think about. And that's kind of why I feel like Bowen has to drop into that second tier, because he's so oddly priced compared to the rest. As far as someone like Kulusevski and Foden, I've risen them simply off the back of their performances. Foden was more of a case of his expected minutes rising and Foden being such an interesting asset. We know that when he starts consistently for City, he's definitely a top FPL asset to have. And City have such a great clean run of games where we expect Foden to do better and to get more involved, that I think he's going to be a great option. As far as Kulusevski, he has tough fixtures. He has got a Chelsea fixture next, and that's why I've pretty much not sent him towards the top of the table. You also have Richarlison, who is no longer dealing with suspension. But I imagine that Richarlison could be someone who could be taking minutes away from someone like Son, for example. Let's say if Spurs were once again off towards a 4-1 start versus another team, I can definitely see outings where at 60 to 70 minutes or even 80 minutes really, Richarlison comes on early on to kind of take minutes away from Son to make sure he gets adequate enough rest. And that's kind of the interesting element of Richarlison, and also why I think he's made assets like Kulusevski and Son worse this season, because he can definitely take a lot of minutes away from them. But Kulusevski had such an uniquely individual great performance, really good crossing, really good finishing with his kind of left foot finesse. I mean, last season he was the asset that I pretty much kept for around 10-12 game weeks in a row, heading towards the end of the season. I had that much confidence in him. And arguably you could probably call me a clown, if we're being quite honest, for putting him as an avoid, because he is just that good as a player. I do think Kulusevski is arguably underpriced if you don't really factor in the minutes, but the minutes are, I think, the unique problem for him at this point in time. Just because Lucas Moura is also on the team, he can also take minutes away from someone like Kulusevski, and we'll have to kind of wait and see. I do think maybe we could end up moving to Kulusevski as the prime 8.0 option, but for now I still kind of prefer Saka and Diaz, and I imagine that they will have equally good performances within the coming fixtures where, you know, they could be scoring 1 goal, 1 assist, or even getting braces as well. So that's kind of how I feel about the assets for now. Mahrez is someone who I've dropped immediately to an avoid. It's just this kind of cycle of Mahrez where in the preseason you're kind of interested with his prospective minutes, with some of the transfers as well, but there's no real reason to do that. I think Pep, especially with some of his veteran players, has shown a tendency to protect them, to play them as little as possible so that they can be rested for key fixtures within the European matches too. Mahrez is someone who's always subject to that kind of bias. He's not going to get enough minutes, and ultimately if you start him with your team, you're dealing with the threat of getting 1 point from Mahrez, getting subbed on at 88 minutes. Just not worth it. If we move on to the premiums, there's literally no difference here. Salah's still the best option. Son, as I mentioned, Son is probably the most interesting asset that I would say, because he had such a great end of the season performance with Conte last season. If you're kind of projecting forwards and just specifically looking at, let's say, the Conte sample data, he looks like one of the best assets in the game. But I do think that this season he will be sharing some of the minutes with Richarlison. And I think also on top of that, you have the added kind of disbenefit as well of him being priced so highly, where you'd probably rather spend that money on someone like Haaland, who's provided such great value at 11.5, even if Haaland has diminished minutes, because we expect the City team to actually play through him as a focal point. Whereas with Son, you've got so much involvement from some of the other players, such as the fullbacks, such as Harry Kane himself, even though Son is frequently involved in most of those chances, especially as one of the corner takers within the team. But yeah, I think that's kind of why Son has been put into such an odd position where not many managers have considered him this year. Still a decent match from him though versus Southampton. Probably could have also got the 1 goal, 1 assist performance just like Salah, but it wasn't to be. And that's kind of how things are right now in FPL. I feel like Salah just provides just a bit more comfort for managers, and it's worth that 1 million that you're going to spend, because you would like to put the captaincy on Salah most days. Whereas for now, I guess at the start of the season, especially considering Chelsea's run of fixtures, the Chelsea game as well, the Tottenham's run of fixtures and the Chelsea game, Son probably doesn't occupy many spots in many people's teams, but he's still definitely a top option. Moving on to the forwards, I actually think we got our estimations quite on the money, to be honest, for FPL this season. As you can see, players like Archer and Greenwood still clearly the best 4.5 options to think about. Archer did sign and I think like a 5-year contract with Aston Villa, so that's going to be quite a promising sign for him to get more minutes over the course of the year. Mitrovic, clearly the best option in FPL at that kind of 6.0, 6.5 price range. And as I was saying with Mitrovic, it's more of a wait and see approach to see how Marco Silva plays within with Fulham in the Premier League. Previously, we were seeing Scott Parker, and he clearly didn't have the faith for Mitrovic to perform in the Premier League. But now that we're actually seeing this Fulham team, we have only seen 1 game's performance, but potentially no need to kind of over-exaggerate how good Mitrovic was, but he did look independently amazing. Mitrovic is definitely an option to think about, right? He will probably break the template, maybe by game weeks 3 and 4, or if you're a more patient manager, buy something like a game week 8 wildcard. And that's simply what Mitrovic provides as a 6.5 option in FPL. He looked amazing versus Liverpool. Someone who clearly this Fulham team is used to and is trying to actively build chances around. And I think he's undeniably going to be a great asset this season, and probably going to have a really, really good performance that maybe allows him to challenge for the Golden Boot. And that's kind of the level that I saw Mitrovic at versus Liverpool, and no reason to kind of move him around the rankings. He's exactly as we thought, but perhaps even better. Solanke and Mbeumo and Welbeck, I would probably say these are all options to think about. Bournemouth still had a good performance, and Solanke is going to be the talisman for the Bournemouth team. Players like Mbeumo and Welbeck are going to be the differentials, with Welbeck being added in. Ultimately, I wouldn't really consider any of them as options. I would much prefer going for Mitrovic and not really even have to think about some of these assets. As I said, Welbeck had a really great performance versus United, but ultimately it just culminated in 1 assist. And that's kind of how it feels like when you're playing for this Brighton team, where some players like Trossard and Welbeck could play consistently incredibly well, but not find themselves being the kind of key FPL assets that we're thinking about consistently. As far as Solanke, I just don't have the same faith in Bournemouth over Fulham. And in Mbeumo, he's going to be that second piece really alongside Tony, and I think Tony's just the much better option. So if we move down to 7.0, 7.5 options, as I was saying, I do feel like we kind of hit the nail on its head there with Tony being the best option. He was someone that we knew would get consistent minutes. We knew he'd be the talisman of this Brentford team. They have strengthened in some positions, weakened in some others, such as losing Eriksen, but we know that their run of fixtures is very, very good. It's very clean. So I would say Tony is definitely one to think about as an option. If you'd like to move into someone cheaper than Jesus, for example, to accommodate for someone like Darwin, potentially, if you're going for a 4-3-3 and you don't trust in Mitrovic for whatever reason, Tony could be the one. Or maybe if you only want to have Haaland in your team, don't want to go for Darwin and want to spend your cash elsewhere, then Tony could definitely be someone as well to pair up within a 4-3-3 system. And that's why Tony is so interesting for now. As far as Bamford and Wilson, these are both players that I expected to do well, and they started off well too, getting involvements. Wilson, someone who got a goal. Bamford, someone who got an assist. Wilson's going to be on penalties. Bamford's going to be on penalties. These are both players that really, really present great value in FPL, potentially more than some of the midfielders. As we were kind of talking about, especially with the midfielders, that 7.0 to 7.5 price point is such a barren wasteland, with exception to Zaha when his fixtures ease up, that you definitely want to be considering the forwards if that's the kind of gap in your team monetarily. Watkins and Martial both have been moved into an avoid. I mean, Watkins, if you were actually listening to my video last week, clearly is an avoid for me. I don't rate him at all as a player, unfortunately. Someone could be the English Werner. I feel like it would be him. As far as Martial, he's going to be a player who is once again a wait and see. He's injured for now. He had a really good preseason, and for me, he's probably the one piece that might improve this United side from an attacking point of view, because he has such a wide skill set as a player, but sometimes with his confidence or whatever is going on in his life, does seem to play a little bit worse than we expect based on what we've seen in individual moments from Martial. So he's just a weird asset, and I feel like we have to just wait for him to kind of get the steam train going before we even consider him again as an FPL asset. Within the 8.0 price point, simply Jesus the best option. Yes, he didn't get an involvement versus Crystal Palace, but we thought, one, Crystal Palace was going to be the tough team within Arsenal's run of fixtures, and two, if you watch that game, he could have gotten 2 assists. Ultimately, we're probably all going to cry out Odegaard being terrible with his one-footedness for why Jesus didn't get a goal contribution. That's simply what it came down to. Jesus, for me, had an electric performance, and I can see in different days versus easier teams, which is what Arsenal have on the cards, that Jesus will be the better option. As far as someone like Havertz and Calvert-Lewin, I mean, just an avoid simply. There's no reason to spend any of that money in teams that don't create significant enough chances, and Calvert-Lewin's injured, so really nothing to think about there. As far as Darwin, Vardy, and Cristiano Ronaldo, nothing's really changed in my estimation of these players. I just feel like, especially with Darwin occupying the same price point as Vardy, it almost makes Vardy as the worst asset, unfortunately. You have someone like Maddison who's cheaper on the team. Even Leicester, I mean, with someone like Dewsbury Hall, I guess if you wanted to plug some sort of Leicester-sized hole in your team, you have him at 5, and it just feels like Vardy is a little bit overpriced when you compare to how lethal an option Darwin could be over the course of the year. And that's kind of how things stand with the forwards, because Haaland and Kane, we've already discussed in probably 2 videos. I would say Kane clearly was the option to think about game week 1, especially if you wanted to punt on the captaincy. But now that window has come and gone, I feel like we're just going to constantly pivot between Haaland and Kane. Kane can be definitely an option to think about game week 3, and I can see a lot of Haaland owners moving into him by then. But for now, Haaland's a better option. He's an immediate game week 2 captaincy punt versus Bournemouth, and then we can think about maybe moving Kane back to being a best option in game week 3, and that's simply how it's going to be, because I can see a lot of managers constantly rotating between them. Because that's the kind of value that they present because of the individual fixtures and how good they can be as captaincy options alongside Salah. And that's how the forwards are. Move on to the defenders. I really feel like there's not many changes within the positions, really, and our estimations of players within the defenders. Nico Williams and Patterson still probably the most interesting 4.0 options. Could also deal with rotation later on in the season. I do think Nico Williams, people were saying that he would drop in price. I just can't see why he'd drop in price. Ultimately, he's just holding a spot in your team as a 4.0 dead-end option, and we don't have a situation like last year where we have someone like Livramento who provides the same amount of value, so I can't really see why it really matters to even think about talking about Nico Williams or Patterson. As far as White, Saliba, these kind of 4.5 options, I've added Sessegnon as an option here as a yellow option. The issue with Sessegnon really is that he is going to be dealing with rotation with Perisic, and I think from a macroscopic perspective, we're going to be dealing with issues with the Spurs fullbacks all year long. We'll have games where Perisic potentially, we would expect him to start, just like in game week 1, arguably, until we got some news from Planet FPL and James. But that's kind of what we're dealing with, right? You have the issue of the Spurs fullbacks constantly rotating, and why even dip your hands into that kind of basket when you could actually just get bitten? Some managers who went for Perisic just got 1 point, whereas someone who could have been a Maverick who went for Emerson could have benefited extremely well. But can you say that manager is going to benefit the next week with Emerson when potentially Doherty starts over him? And I can't even say, even though Perisic has such individual quality as a player, whether I would actually say he's someone to go and think about until, let's say, game weeks 3 to 5 and beyond, because we want to see a little bit more permanence. We want to see that the starting 11 stays relatively unmalleable, I suppose, before we think about going for the Spurs fullbacks. And that's kind of why I opted personally to go for someone like Ruben Dias, because it was easier to have the option to move down from Ruben Dias than it was to move up from Kieran Trippier, as an example. And I feel like I made the right decision there, but that's simply because I just didn't have enough answers around the Spurs fullback. So Sessegnon is an interesting option. He's probably better than any of the options here outside of the Arsenal defenders when we're comparing to other assets like Johnny, Duncan, Dalot. But ultimately, the other assets probably will get games where they play 90 minutes and benefit from that and maybe find a goal contribution through that, whereas someone like Sessegnon could be riding the bench for 2-3 games in a row, or coming on and getting 1 point for multiple games in a row, which was kind of the situation with Reguilon owners last year when Conte came into the team team and actually was trialing Reguilon at various points of the season. So that's kind of, I feel like, what the issue is with the Spurs players. The Arsenal players are clearly the best at 4.5. I've been raving about Saliba for a long time, and I think he justifiably deserves a spot as the top option at 4.5 alongside Ben White. He could be getting more bonus points just by his kind of defensive involvements in the game. I don't see him as someone who's constantly pinging crosses everywhere, so he's not going to get bonus points through that. But clearly, just by being a standout defender and being such a rock, really, I feel like Saliba is going to be a great option, and we saw that through the bonus points when we compared options between, let's say, Arsenal players within Ben White and Saliba individually on bonus points, or even how he overcame someone like Gabriel in bonus points. As far as the 5.0 options, there's only really been one change here, and that's just to drop someone like Perisic. I did foresee Perisic being a top asset at the start of the game. I've also added Zinchenko as an asset as well alongside Gabriel. I did mention Gabriel was the more interesting option for me, and I still think that is the case going forwards, but the Zinchenko game versus Crystal Palace really did change my opinion on him as a player. I just feel like, especially if teams were to incorporate using defensive fullbacks, which not every team that Arsenal played in the preseason were, there will be chances where Zinchenko will be that odd man who's unmarked, because let's say players like Martinelli and Jesus will be occupying the kind of central spaces up top, especially within the pockets between the right back and the centre back, and also the centre back partnership. So there will be free pockets of space for Zinchenko to actually move inwards and take shots. So if you see the early 20 minutes when Zinchenko cracked a great shot versus Crystal Palace, that is a key opportunity that he will probably be benefiting from over the course of the year. His actual goal involvement itself from the corner, I don't really see that being able to be recreated by this very creative Arsenal team in terms of their set piece structures. But for me, Zinchenko is someone who could also get a lot of bonus points too with the way he plays and how involved he is within this Arsenal attack in terms of how they build the ball up. So I do think Zinchenko is definitely a great option. Probably a mistake on my part to disregard him as an asset. But I don't think he's going to be, let's say, one of the top offensive fullbacks in the league, but definitely one that will get a lot of points consistently. And I'm kind of thinking about someone like Marc Cucurella last year from Brighton, who, even though he didn't have many goal involvements, actually did get a considerable amount of points respective to the rest of his team. So that's kind of maybe the interesting position that Zinchenko holds in FPL. As far as Perisic, as I said, he's dropped because of the fear of rotation, the Chelsea game being a tough one, and just something to think about where there might be games in the future where Ryan Sessegnon gets the start because Conte, for whatever reason, might prefer Sessegnon at various times and might feel that Perisic might need to be rested for certain games. I think it's more of a wait and see now with Perisic than anything. As far as Walker and Ake, these are options that I've now kind of priced similarly because Ake is someone who, as we've seen in the preseason, frequently gets involved in goal contributions. And he's always there within set pieces opportunities. So with Stones not actually getting consistent minutes now, even though Laporte's injured, I've got to rise Ake. It seems like Pep really does rate having Ake in the team. And if that's the case, he's definitely a steal at his price point. But maybe a transfer that you kind of have to book in the future because Laporte will find his way back into the team, as an example. Trippier is still a top option, got the clean sheet versus Nottingham Forest. Wasn't necessarily as involved from open play than I actually expected, and perhaps a little bit better because I don't actually own Trippier as an asset. But still, definitely this Newcastle team has improved leaps and bounds in defence, just in individual positions with Botman coming in and Pope coming in as well, but also just what Trippier can do when he actually has more of the ball and he's actually allowed to occupy some of the attacking positions in the team. So him and his set pieces is going to make him a very valuable asset. It's just the fixtures that make him probably someone not to think about in the immediate future. I wouldn't transfer into Trippier, that's for sure. So if you already own Trippier for now, I'd say benefit from the short term and probably pivot away from him. Maybe find your way back into Trippier later in the season. As far as options like Dean and Cash, I've dropped them preemptively as well. I just don't really like what Dean and Cash present. The Aston Villa defense doesn't really look any better than in the previous year. Yes, Dean and Cash are attacking fullbacks, and yes, that provides a lot of value in FPL, but at the end of the day, we're looking at clean sheets as the primary basis for getting points. From that point of view, I just can't really rate them as assets, and Aston Villa's games do run incredibly worse. The Bournemouth game was one where I think everyone was expecting probably for them to get a clean sheet, and why a lot of people were tempted to start Aston Villa defensive pieces. And the fact that they looked so poor versus Bournemouth is probably an indication of, one, Bournemouth being better than we expect, and also, two, Aston Villa definitely not being up to the kind of standards that we expect them to be, especially since they made some upgrades in key positions this year. As far as Doherty, I feel like he occupies a similar position to other assets like Emerson as well. Both him and Emerson deal with the same issue where they're just competing for the same positions and will probably start almost alternating weeks if they both continue to have good performances. Yes, there was a period last year where I mentioned that Conte likes to start with specific players. For whatever reason, it seems like Doherty has kind of fallen down his pecking order. and we just can't really make an estimation on who's actually preferred by Conte until we get to see Doherty play more, until we get to see Emerson play more. And I feel like that's just a weird position we are at with Spurs fullback. As far as the defenders and the premium defenders, no changes other than Chilwell and She Rising. Chilwell did get a goal contribution, and what I liked about that was because Marcos Alonso is so close to the Barcelona transfer, you have a really good opportunity here to move into someone like Chilwell and benefit from him. The other issue, though, is you have someone like Reece James, who's probably good at 90 minutes every game and probably going to get more bonus points than Chilwell, especially since Chilwell needs to somewhat manage his minutes, and you have Cucurella there helping out with that situation. So for me, Reece James is still the better asset, and Chilwell is now probably just secondary to Reece James. Do we have enough money in our teams to move into Chilwell is probably one of the questions to think about. Maybe there will be points in time in the season where we once again have to move into a double Chelsea fullback scenario, but I don't think that's immediately the case now. I still prefer options like Robertson over Chilwell, even though Robertson had a pretty poor performance as part of the Liverpool defence versus Fulham. And that's kind of how things stand. It's just really the difference in the quality of opponents, I guess. Fulham probably a lot better than we expected, and Everton just about as bad as we expected, if we're being honest, in terms of being able to give teams an opportunity to get a clean sheet, especially after losing Richarlison as well. So that's kind of how the defenders are. Moving on to the last position in the cheat sheet, we have the goalkeepers, and I really feel like nothing has really changed. If we look at the 4.0 keepers, my estimations of Ward/Iverson, that goalkeeper pairing is exactly the same. It's really good value for money if you felt like you had money to spend in other positions in FPL. And it seems like, as I said, if you were watching this live stream as well, Brendan Rodgers had a really good quote about how he didn't really see the need to dip into the market, and he feels like Iverson and Ward are good enough to kind of compete for that spot. So that was really positive news for managers who are going for that kind of team structure, and I can see why there's value in that. As far as the other positions, I feel like the 4.5s are exactly how I thought it was going to be, and I think that will be the case for the rest of the season. Brighton's a very, very formidable team, and Sanchez is a top goalkeeper on that basis, whereas options like Leeds and options like Brentford, I do think they're going to be worse defenses than Brighton in comparison. And even though Raya's interesting from a kind of passing out of the back perspective, or Meslier is a keeper who is a really good shot stopper, I just think the opportunities that and the quality of opportunities that they'll face will probably impact the amount of clean sheets that these teams get respective to each other. I think Brighton will get the most clean sheets, whereas maybe there will be independent games where, let's say, Meslier and Raya get great opportunities to get a lot of bonus points through saves and things like that. So that's kind of the comparison you have to make. But I feel like Sanchez, just because the fixtures were so good, particularly after the United game, that I have to say I think Sanchez still reigns as the king option there. Pickford definitely not one to think about. Ramsdale, Mendy, Pope, these are the best options at 5.0. I've also downgraded Sa. It's clear that this Wolves team have incorporated this new attacking structure, but it also means that there's a significant detriment on their defense. There's no real reason to go into Sa. I think he's overpriced, arguably, compared to some of these other keeper assets, because when you look at the teams on paper between Arsenal, Chelsea, and Newcastle, I think it's very, very obvious to say that the defense is kind of pale in comparison when we're looking at Wolves' defense compared to the rest. As far as 5.5 options between Alisson and Ederson, I've actually moved Ederson towards a 5.5 kind of top option alongside Alisson. Ultimately, I feel like it was unfair for me to compare, let's say, Ederson as an asset at 5.5 to what Alisson brings to the table at 5.5, and I think that was me being a little bit unfair. I think Ederson actually holds really good value as a 5.5 independent asset in the game when we compare to other positions, and that's why I've moved him up to where he deserves to be as a top option. And because City's run of fixtures are so good and they've overcome the West Ham fixture, already getting a clean sheet there, I just see it as kind of an open field day for both of these keepers to get a lot of points. And potentially, if you're even considering a wild card, I can completely understand moving into Ederson if you feel like you missed the boat on the City defenders. But obviously, that's a very, very knee-jerky move. Probably not one I'd recommend. But that's kind of how things stand for now with the keepers and the cheat sheet as well. So thank you guys so much for watching this week, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week.